The world felt heavy that day, heavy in a way that made it difficult to breathe, as if the weight of the sky pressed against my shoulders, pushing me into an endless sea of thoughts and worries. I'm Jane, and at that moment, life felt like it was too loud. My mind raced with questions and doubts I couldn't answer, and I just needed to escape from it all. I found myself walking down a narrow, secluded path near the woods behind our house. It was an old trail, one I'd walked many times before, but today it felt different. The leaves beneath my boots crunched in the silence, and the only sounds I could hear were the distant chirps of birds and the occasional rustle of the wind through the trees. The path led to a small clearing, a quiet, forgotten space in the middle of the woods, where no one seemed to go anymore. This was my haven, my escape, the place I could come to when the world became too overwhelming. But that day, as I approached the clearing, I saw something, or rather, someone, that I hadn't expected to see. There, sitting on the edge of a worn wooden bench, was a boy. A stranger, though somehow not a stranger at all. He had dark hair that fell messily over his forehead, and his eyes were like a storm, swirling with something intense, something deep. He wasn't looking at me, but I could feel his presence, like an electric current in the air. I stopped in my tracks, unsure of what to do. The clearing had always been my secret, my place to be alone with my thoughts, and now there was someone else there, invading it. But I couldn't bring myself to leave. There was something about him, something magnetic, that made me stand still and watch him even though he was a stranger. He must have felt my gaze because, after a few moments, he turned. His eyes met mine, and for a brief second, we just stared at each other. I felt a flutter in my chest, something I couldn't quite name. It was as if everything around us had disappeared, leaving only him and me in that small, quiet place. Finally, he spoke. "I didn't think anyone else would come here today," he said, his voice low but warm, like it belonged to a person who knew how to appreciate the silence. I blinked, realizing I had been standing there too long, just staring at him. "I come here to think," I replied, feeling a little embarrassed. He smiled, a small, knowing smile, like he understood. "Yeah, me too," he said, looking around the clearing. "It's peaceful here." I nodded, unsure of how to continue. There was something about him that made my usual shyness slip away. I had never been good at talking to people, especially not strangers, but something about the way he looked at me made me feel like I could speak without fear. "I'm Jane," I said, finally breaking the silence. He raised an eyebrow, as if surprised by the formality. "I'm Jack," he replied. His voice carried a quiet confidence that intrigued me. I took a step closer, feeling drawn to him. There was an undeniable pull between us, something that felt like it had been there long before either of us had ever met. Jack shifted on the bench, patting the spot next to him. "You can sit if you want. I promise I'm not as strange as I might seem," he said with a chuckle. I hesitated for a moment before sitting down beside him. The space between us was small, but it felt like there was a vast distance that neither of us dared to cross yet. I could feel the warmth of his body, the faint scent of cologne mixed with the fresh air of the forest. It was an intoxicating combination, one that made me feel both nervous and comforted at the same time. "So, what brings you here?" Jack asked, his tone light, but there was a depth to it that made me want to open up. I shrugged, looking down at the ground. I needed some space. "I guess I've been feeling a little lost lately." "Yeah, I get that," he said, his voice soft, almost too understanding. He turned slightly toward me, his eyes focused, as though he was truly listening. "Sometimes the world feels so loud, and it's hard to hear yourself think." I couldn't help but agree. "Exactly," I whispered. "It's like there's all this noise inside my head, and I just need it to stop." Jack was quiet for a moment, as if contemplating my words. When he spoke again, his voice was softer, like he was sharing something intimate, something personal. "I come here for the same reason," he said. "To find a little peace." I looked at him then, really looked at him, his tousled hair, the way his jaw tensed when he was thinking, the small crease between his brows as if he was carrying a weight I didn't understand. "You don't seem like the type of guy who needs peace," I said, smiling a little despite myself. "You seem like you've got everything figured out." Jack chuckled, a sound that was almost melancholic. "Trust me, I'm just as lost as the next person," he said. "I'm not sure I have anything figured out. But I know what it feels like to want to run away from it all. To just find a place where it all makes sense." There was a heaviness in his voice, a vulnerability that made me want to reach out and comfort him. But I stayed quiet, unsure of what to say. The air around us was thick with unspoken words, and I could feel the tension between us growing. But it wasn't the kind of tension that felt awkward or forced. It was the kind of tension that came from the connection we shared, the way we both understood what it was like to feel alone, to want more than what the world seemed to offer. I took a deep breath, letting the silence stretch between us. "Do you believe in love?" I asked suddenly, the question slipping from my lips before I had time to second-guess myself. Jack didn't answer right away. He just looked at me, his eyes searching mine, as if trying to understand why I had asked. Finally, he spoke, his voice low, almost a whisper. "I do," he said. "But I think love is more than just romance. It's about connection. Finding someone who sees you, who understands you." My heart fluttered at his words. It was like he had taken the thoughts in my mind and given them life. I had always believed in love, but in a way that was so much deeper than just the fairy tales. Love was more than the spark of chemistry or the thrill of attraction. It was about knowing someone, understanding their flaws, their fears, and still choosing to be with them. "That's exactly what I mean," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I think I've always wanted that. To find someone who gets me." Jack's eyes softened, and I felt the weight of his gaze, the way he was really seeing me in that moment. It was as if the world around us had faded away, and we were the only two people left in that quiet space. The minutes passed slowly, like the world outside had slowed down just for us. I could feel the warmth of his presence beside me, and it was like I didn't want to be anywhere else. We didn't say much more for a while, but somehow the silence between us felt full, alive. Finally, Jack turned to face me, his expression serious now, but with a trace of that warmth in his eyes. "Jane," he said, his voice gentle. "I'm not sure what's happening here, but I can't deny that I feel something too. Something I can't explain." I swallowed hard, my heart racing in my chest. I had been feeling it too, the pull, the magnetic attraction that seemed to come from nowhere. "I don't know what this is either," I said softly. "But I feel it too." And then, without saying another word, Jack leaned in closer. His breath was warm on my skin, and his hand reached out, brushing against mine. The touch was soft but deliberate, sending a shock of electricity through my body. He didn't kiss me, not yet, but there was something in the way he looked at me, something that told me he was waiting for the right moment. And I felt it too, the right moment. In that lonely place, in that quiet, forgotten space between the trees, I realized that sometimes love wasn't something you could plan or predict. It wasn't something that came with clear answers or easy paths. It was a feeling, something that just happened. And I couldn't deny that I was falling for him in a way that made my heart ache in the most beautiful way. As we sat there in the quiet of the forest, the rain having stopped and the world around us still and peaceful, I couldn't help but feel that this moment, this conversation, was the start of something new. something that felt like it was meant to be. And in that lonely place, with Jack by my side, I realized that sometimes love begins in the most unexpected of ways.